The worst part, in my opinion, of turning down a client is, of course, you're going to miss revenue. That's huge, and you're going to talk more about that. But disappointing those referral sources that you have been working for months for them to get you to call you just one time, just give us one shot. And then when they go to give you your shot, if you can't take it, oh, that's kind of gut wrenching right there.
Yeah, yeah.
Money comes and goes, but relationships are so important in this business. So, okay, carry on.
Exactly. Yeah. You're spending a lot of time building relationships with case managers, social workers, all these people who can potentially give you a referral. And that's the thing about relationships is that it's their reputation on the line as well as yours. And so, you know, uh, you really want to capitalize on the relationship that you've built, and you want to be able to deliver on that promise. And if you don't have a caregiver right away, and say you have to source them from the broader job market, you're starting with Indeed or social media, anywhere that any particular recruitment channel that you choose, you have to start from scratch. You have to do reference checks, pretty lengthy interview just to get to know them. And when you finally staff them, and let's say they passed their background check, once you staff them, you're kind of rolling the dice because you don't have any prior working relationship with them. And so there's this anxiety that, especially a lot of the agencies that we've worked with in the past, they have this anxiety about staffing new caregivers. Um, and that's if you were able to source and pre-screen them and onboard them on time for that client
Right.
to be able to get that. Because if they don't get a caregiver from you, they're going to look somewhere else. So if you can do it in a short period of time, that's great. But again, this key statistic, 63% of agencies that have turned down at least one client, that's a lot. And further into the presentation, we'll go over what that actually costs you on a dollar basis.
Okay.
So moving on to the next one, out of the 63% of agencies that have turned down a client, roughly 40% of those agencies were consistently turning down clients due to staffing shortage. So that's, at least two or three. It could be happening on a recurring basis. Um, and what that really comes down to is, if especially if it's happening consistently, it's caused by overinvestment in marketing and underinvestment in recruitment. um,
Okay.
you know uh, Regardless of the size of the agency, the owners, the administrators, you're wearing a lot of hats. A lot of the owners that we work with, they prefer to do the marketing, they prefer to do the sales. They're the face of the company. And they want to build these relationships with different referral sources. But the problem is, you're spread a little too thin. Maybe you don't have other staff to focus on recruitment. Maybe you yourself, you simply don't have enough time to focus on recruitment. And so there's kind of this disconnect, and it's something that we're completely empathetic to. It's just it's a lack of resources, a lack of time.
Yeah.
But the key is you need to be able to align those two things. So the
Okay.
the better that you align marketing with your recruitment, and that those two things can scale proportionately, that's what will unlock the growth for your agency.
And they need to communicate with each other. Marketing and recruiting have to have conversations. Your hiring manager has to know what's coming down the pike, what we're looking at. That might mean weekly meetings for your team, but you know, because marketing is going to be bringing in clients, handing them, just expecting them to be taken care of, and you don't need that big battle of, but I brought new clients, but we can't handle them. Or we can't do a great job. I'm not going to be able to do our best. You want to keep up to your standards. And so that can be very stressful. Yeah, I get it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so here's kind of a broader look, historically. And this was around 2014 to 2019. 2014 is when the industry really started looking at at this data. Home care has been around for a little while, but data has only been recently, implemented, and we started tracking these metrics. So, starting from 2014 to 2019, pre-pandemic, the client rejection rate was about 60 to 70%. And again, this is specific to a staffing shortage.
And when you say rejection rate, the same thing from the previous slide, you're saying 60 to 70% of agencies are saying they have turned down at least one client because of staffing shortages. And this is before the pandemic,
This is before the
where
pandemic.
where we lost 2 million workers. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
All right.
absolutely. And of course, the pandemic itself didn't help. It skyrocketed to 80 to 85%, and that's due to the obvious things like, the we had to wait for the rollout of vaccinations. There was a shortage of PPE, and you happen to be sending people to the most vulnerable population during this time. And so of course it didn't stop the demand for home care, but it certainly stopped the home care industry's ability to serve those people. So
Okay.
um, and before we go into the future stats, just to give you an idea of how much it costs to reject or decline a client due to staffing shortage or for any reason at all, we took uh, you know uh, I would say like US average of revenue per month, which is around 3,000 to 4,000, but 3,000 a month in revenue conservatively, that comes out to 36,000 in revenue for the year. And so that's not net, that's gross. And so it's still a lot of money, but when you think about it, you really have to take these situations seriously. So every time uh, you know, you turn down a client for any reason whatsoever, that's costing you around 36,000, you know, give or
Yeah.
take, plus or minus $3,000, but it's still a lot. Um, home care has historically thin margins, and so you want to make sure that you're capitalizing on every opportunity you get for a new client.
Right. Okay.
And so the data that we got from the benchmarking report, it didn't really go over what it would look like over the next 9 to 10 years. And so we did that ourselves. We ran the data through some AI models to really understand, okay, what would it look like 10 years from now if all everything remained constant? And that means, you know, policies remained more or less the same, the workforce remained the same, things like that. And so 10 years from now, it would look closer to pandemic levels because these pools of available workers, it's going to get smaller and smaller due to various factors. And so something obviously needs to change. There needs to be better adoption of hiring practices, new technologies, new policies. For example, one of the policies that's been floated around by the Alliance was the idea of a specialized work visa. So you can get workers, more workers into the pool of available people that you can hire. And so that's one of the things that's floating around. There's a few other interesting policies, but the thing with policies is you don't know how long it's going to take, and you can't really rely on that to be the solution for your business. You need
And
to
when you say
implement
policy, you're talking about federal policies,
federal
right? Like,
policy,
okay,
statewide policy.
incentives and statewide. Okay.
Exactly, exactly. So, um, you know, the more important thing is the adoption of best practices, new technologies, workforce development. When it comes to workforce development, it's can you provide a broader career path for the caregivers? Can that be a launching point for another other future roles that can not just benefit their career, but also your business. And so we'll
Okay.
talk a little bit about that as well. So, And this is kind of the other elephant in the room, which is turnover. And so not only are agencies dealing with a shortage of workers to hire, you're also dealing with high turnover rates. And so, if you take the average of all these different industry sectors, that comes out to about 84% for the rest of the industry. And so that includes NAC, home care industry, association membership. And so think about that. That's on an annual basis, 84% of your workforce is leaving. But what's
Ouch.
interesting is that home care masters, and so that's agencies that bill at least 5 million a year or more, they're closer to 47%. I mean, that's almost half. And
How are
so
they doing that?
that's a very interesting thing that we'll go over with some other data. But before we go over that, it needs to be said that high turnover will only increase your overhead costs, right? So
Hmm.
you're hiring more than you otherwise would. In an ideal scenario, you would just be hiring new caregivers every time you get a new client and your existing staff isn't available. That's actually it's not the most ideal scenario, but it actually is an ideal scenario because you're not covering for any turnover. But in reality, you have to cover for new clients, and you have to cover for the caregivers that are dropping off. And so the reason it's so high, um, it's due to the nature of the industry.
Okay.
Caregiving, it's a pretty unpredictable job, and there's not a lot of income stability because the caregiver, especially if you have a full-time client, you have one caregiver per client on average. And once that client either passes away or needs to be moved on to higher level care, like a facility, that's pretty much the end of that caregiver's source of income. And so there's a lot of timing involved. It's very unlikely that you'll have an available client at the same time that the caregiver ends their service with their previous client.
Oh, right. I mean, it's a blessing when it happens, but it usually at least a week or two before you could find something that fits for them. And so the big issue is, and of course, we know this got worse in 2015 because up to that point, we didn't have the overtime issues, right? But
Mhm.
since overtime, every caregiver already works for at least two agencies because they've got to have a backup or they've got to have additional hours. And so if their backup or second backup agency has the right client for them, after their client has passed or moved on from your service, that's it. Hopefully you'll get them back someday, but you don't know. It's a gamble. So
Mhm.
I think that turnover rates increased a lot after the overtime rule, but then since then we've had even more and additional challenges. But because caregivers already work for multiple agencies, yeah, that can be tough. Okay.
Yeah.